Ah, welcome back, you beautiful disasters, you walking psychological anomalies, you souls too complex for their comfort zones. Let's talk about something they don't want you to know, something they're desperately trying to bury in classified files and redacted reports, somewhere in a government building, in a sterile office with no windows and fluorescent lights that hum like dying insects. There's an analyst who was assigned to monitor you, to track your patterns, to predict your next move, to document your behavior like you're some kind of case study. And guess what happened? He broke. Not you, him. The professional observer, the trained psychologist, the one with clearance levels and protocols and years of studying human behavior. He's the one who couldn't handle what he saw when he looked at you for too long. They thought it would be routine, didn't they? Another subject, another file, another predictable human being, following predictable patterns, making predictable mistakes, living a predictable life that fits neatly into their models and algorithms and behavioral charts. But then they assigned someone to actually watch you, to really study the way you move through this world, to analyze how you process pain and betrayal and isolation, to document how you survive things that should have destroyed you 3 times over. And that analyst, that poor trained professional with his degrees and his protocols and his clinical detachment, he started seeing something that didn't fit any framework he'd ever learned. He started noticing patterns that violated every rule of human psychology. He watched you transform trauma into fuel, watched you evolve in real time, watched you do things that shouldn't be possible according to everything he thought he knew about the human mind. Let me paint you the picture, because this is where it gets beautiful in the darkest possible way. This analyst, let's call him what he is, a professional stalker with government approval. He started his assignment like any other, confident, methodical, probably even a little bored at first. He pulled up your file, scanned your history, made his initial notes, set up his monitoring systems, prepared his psychological baseline assessment, all standard procedure for someone trained to dissect personalities like they're lab specimens. But then something shifted. He started noticing that you don't react like other subjects. You don't follow the patterns that 99.9% of humanity follows when faced with stress, betrayal, loss, isolation, the things that break normal people. Instead, you do something they can't explain. You adapt. You evolve. You transmute. You become something different every time they think they've figured you out. And it terrified him, because he realized he wasn't observing a subject. He was witnessing a phenomenon. Every day he logged into his systems, pulled up his surveillance feeds, reviewed his behavioral notes, and every day the cognitive dissonance grew stronger, louder, more unbearable. His training told him humans break under pressure. They crumble. They become predictable in their desperation. They follow clear psychological patterns that can be mapped and manipulated and controlled. But you kept doing the impossible. You kept surviving what should have destroyed you, kept thriving in conditions designed to break you down, kept evolving beyond what his models predicted was possible. And the worst part for him, the part that really shattered his carefully constructed worldview, was watching you do it all without any of the support systems, safety nets, validation, or external resources that psychology says humans need to survive trauma. See, they sent him to study you. But what happened instead is you became the teacher he never asked for. Every time he thought he understood your breaking point, You revealed there was no breaking point, just transformation points, evolution points, upgrade points that you triggered through sheer force of will and necessity. He watched you lose everything that normal psychology says humans need to maintain sanity and stability. And instead of collapsing into predictable patterns of dysfunction, you rebuilt yourself into something his textbooks never mentioned, his professors never described, his training never prepared him for. You became the glitch in every system, the exception that proves the rule is bullshit, the living evidence that humans are capable of far more than the institutions want to admit. And that realization, that slow, horrifying realization that maybe everything he'd been taught was a lie designed to keep people manageable, that's what broke him. So now, after months of watching you, months of trying to fit you into frameworks that kept shattering under the weight of your reality, months of losing sleep because his observations contradicted everything he thought he knew about human psychology and limitation and control, he did something unprecedented in his field. He requested a psychological evaluation, not for you, but for himself. He went to his superiors, the ones who assigned him to monitor you in the first place. And he essentially said, "I can't do this anymore." Watching this person has fundamentally altered my understanding of reality, and I need someone to evaluate whether I'm still mentally fit for this work, because what I'm witnessing shouldn't be possible. And yet it keeps happening. And I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if everything I was taught is fundamentally wrong. Think about that for a second. Really let it sink in. The trained professional broke before you did. They sent a psychological warfare specialist to monitor you. And you psychologically disarmed him without even knowing he existed, without trying, without caring, just by being authentically yourself in your raw, unfiltered survival mode. He came equipped with every tool, every technique, every manipulation tactic designed to understand and predict human behavior, and you rendered all of it useless simply by refusing to be predictable, by refusing to fit into neat categories, by refusing to break in ways that make sense to people who've never been through what you've survived. You didn't fight him, you didn't resist him, you didn't even acknowledge his existence. And that absolute indifference to being observed, that complete lack of performance for an invisible audience, that authentic existence that doesn't change whether someone's watching or not, that's what destroyed his confidence in everything he thought he understood about psychology and human nature and control. Let's go deeper, because this rabbit hole is bottomless and beautiful in its darkness. This analyst, he started noticing things about you that made him question not just his training, but the entire framework of institutional psychology. He watched you experience betrayal from people you loved, and instead of developing trust issues like his models predicted, you developed discernment, the ability to see through people's masks faster, to identify authentic connections quicker, to protect your energy more efficiently. He watched you lose opportunities that should have devastated you. And instead of spiraling into depression like the statistics suggested, you pivoted, adapted, found alternative paths, created opportunities where none existed, proved that resilience isn't just bouncing back, but bouncing forward into territories his maps didn't even chart. He documented instances where you should have sought validation, should have craved approval, should have needed external reinforcement to maintain your sense of self, but instead, You kept building your identity from internal sources, from your own values, from your own experiences, from your own understanding of who you are, regardless of what anyone else thinks or says or believes about you. And that self-sufficiency, that emotional independence, that ability to exist fully without needing constant validation from others, it violated everything modern psychology teaches about human social needs and attachment theory, and the fundamental requirement for external validation to maintain psychological health. You were proving that maybe humans don't need what the institutions say they need. Maybe the dependency they teach is manufactured. Maybe the frameworks are designed to create weakness, not explain it. Every week, he filed his reports, and every week the cognitive dissonance grew stronger because his observations contradicted his conclusions. The data violated the models. The reality refused to match the theory. He'd write about your isolation, expecting to document deterioration. But instead, he had to report evolution, transformation, strengthening, the exact opposite of what happens to normal subjects under similar conditions. He'd analyze your responses to stress, expecting fight or flight patterns, but discovering something else entirely. A third option his training never mentioned: transform and transcend, the ability to alchemize pressure into power, to convert pain into progress, to use stress as fuel rather than letting it be destructive. And each report became harder to write because he knew he was documenting something that shouldn't exist according to every psychological model he'd ever studied. Then came the moment that really shattered him, the observation that made him realize he wasn't qualified to analyze you. Nobody was qualified because you weren't operating within normal human parameters anymore. He noticed that you'd stopped seeking closure from people who hurt you, stopped needing explanations from those who betrayed you, stopped wanting apologies from those who wronged you, and the psychological community would label that as avoidance or denial or unhealthy coping. But he watched long enough to see the truth. You weren't avoiding anything. You'd transcended the need for it. You'd evolved beyond requiring external resolution to achieve internal peace. You'd figured out that closure is something you give yourself, not something you wait for others to provide. And that realization, that level of psychological autonomy, it's not supposed to be achievable without years of therapy and professional guidance. Yet there you were, doing it organically through sheer necessity and survival instinct. He watched you cut people off without explanation, without drama, without revenge, just clean surgical removal of toxicity from your life. And his training screamed that this was cold, emotionally stunted, unhealthy detachment. But the longer he observed, the more he realized it was actually the healthiest thing he'd ever witnessed. The ability to recognize what doesn't serve you and remove it without guilt or second-guessing, or the need to justify your boundaries to people who wouldn't respect them anyway. You weren't being cold. You were being clear. You weren't being cruel. You were being protective of your own energy and peace. And there's nothing in his psychological training that prepares analysts for observing someone who's mastered self-protection without becoming defensive. Someone who's achieved boundaries without building walls. Someone who's found peace without needing permission. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The part that really made him question his sanity and request that evaluation. He started noticing that the more he studied you, the more his own life fell apart. Not because you were doing anything to him, not because you even knew he existed, but because watching you live authentically made him realize how inauthentically he'd been living. How much of his own life was performance. How many of his own choices were made to please others or fit in or maintain approval or avoid conflict. You became a mirror he never asked for, reflecting back the uncomfortable truth that he'd spent his entire life following rules and seeking validation and building a career on understanding human behavior, while never actually living authentically himself. And that realization, that sudden awareness that he'd been studying human psychology without ever truly understanding his own, that he'd been analyzing others while remaining a stranger to himself, that broke something fundamental in his professional identity. His colleagues started noticing changes in him, asking if he was okay, commenting that he seemed distracted or distant or different somehow. He couldn't explain to them that watching you had fundamentally altered his perception of what humans are capable of, what psychology really is, what freedom actually means. He couldn't tell them that monitoring you had made him realize that most of institutional psychology exists not to free people, but to manage them, not to unleash potential, but to contain it within acceptable parameters, not to foster true mental health, but to maintain social conformity disguised as wellness. These were dangerous thoughts for someone in his position, career-ending revelations that he couldn't voice without destroying his credibility. So he kept filing his reports while internally unraveling, kept maintaining his professional facade while privately experiencing a complete paradigm shift in his understanding of human nature and institutional control. The final straw, the observation that made him finally request that psychological evaluation, came when he realized you'd stopped playing any games entirely. Not just the obvious manipulation games that toxic people play, but all games, the social performance games, the status-seeking games, the validation-chasing games, the comparison games, the approval-seeking games. Every subtle and not-so-subtle game that humans play to feel significant or superior or secure or seen. You'd somehow exited the entire gaming system while still existing within society, and that shouldn't be possible. People who reject social games become isolated outcasts, but you seem to be thriving in a different dimension entirely, operating by different rules. Or maybe no rules at all, just authentic response to life without the need to strategize or manipulate or perform. And watching that level of genuine freedom, that complete absence of psychological game playing, it made him realize he'd never been free a single day in his life, that every interaction he'd ever had was calculated, every relationship strategic, every choice made with an eye toward how it would look to others or affect his status or maintain his position. So he wrote his request, probably the most honest thing he'd ever written in his professional life. I need a psychological evaluation because extended observation of subject X has resulted in what I can only describe as an existential crisis regarding the fundamental assumptions underlying behavioral psychology. And I'm no longer confident in my ability to analyze this subject objectively because my observations consistently contradict my training. And I'm beginning to question whether my training was designed to understand human behavior or to constrain it. They probably read that request with concern, maybe alarm, definitely confusion, because analysts don't break, subjects break. That's how it's supposed to work. The observer remains detached, while the observed remains vulnerable. But you flipped the script without even trying, without even knowing, just by refusing to be vulnerable in ways that made sense to them, by refusing to break in patterns they could predict and manage and control. And now that analyst sits in mandatory counseling sessions, trying to explain to another psychologist how watching you live your life with complete authenticity and zero need for external validation has made him question everything about his career, his choices, his life, his understanding of human psychology and potential and freedom. He's trying to articulate how someone he was supposed to be analyzing ended up teaching him more about psychology than all his years of formal education. How the subject of his surveillance became his unwitting mentor in authentic living. How the person he was paid to understand made him realize he'd never understood himself. And the therapist evaluating him probably thinks he's experiencing burnout or vicarious trauma or some standard occupational hazard. But the truth is far more profound and disturbing to institutional psychology. He's experiencing awakening. The painful recognition that everything he was taught might be a framework designed to limit human potential rather than understand it. And you triggered that awakening simply by existing outside their frameworks. Think about the poetry of this situation because it's darkly beautiful. They sent someone to study you like you're an experiment, and you turned him into your student without ever knowing he existed. They paid him to monitor you like you're a threat, and you showed him who the real threat was. The institutions that train people to observe and analyze and categorize and control rather than to live and feel and grow and evolve. They gave him tools to dissect your psychology. And you demonstrated that psychology can't be dissected because it's not static. It's fluid, constantly evolving, adapting, transforming in response to life, rather than following predetermined patterns that make institutional observers comfortable. You weren't trying to teach anything. You weren't performing for anyone. You were just surviving, thriving, evolving. And that authentic journey broke through every defense mechanism and professional detachment this trained analyst had built around himself. Now he goes home at night and can't stop thinking about the person he's supposed to be monitoring. Not because you're doing anything dramatic or dangerous or noteworthy by conventional standards, but because you're living proof that humans don't have to be what psychology says they have to be, don't have to need what consumer culture says they have to need, don't have to break where institutions predict they'll break. Your evidence of possibilities, his education never mentioned. Potential, his training never acknowledged. Strength, his models never accounted for. Freedom, his frameworks never imagined possible. And that evidence, that living, breathing proof that the emperor has no clothes, that the psychological establishment might be built on assumptions designed to manage rather than liberate. That's what made him question not just his ability to analyze you, but his entire professional foundation and personal identity.